your solution in non-regulated countries?
So that's an excellent question. It turns out that each country, every single country that I have looked at, has some kind of regulatory mechanism. What they may have a functional or non-functional system. But there, the opportunity often comes from hospitals, because there is a demand, at least in some hospitals, that the quality of drugs should be good. So, for example, in many African countries, hospitals sometimes operate independently. They could be faith-based, so charity-based hospitals. They could be with the NGO and others, and they are certainly very interested, because at the end of the day, you have to think about the cost that they are bearing by having these people who are sort of not getting better, right? They are staying in the system, they are getting sicker, they are more demanding of their resources. So the interest there is going to be not a very top-down approach, but sort of trying to find the right partners. That could be at a provincial level, that could be at a hospital by hospital level, and that's what we've been thinking about. The challenge is that that usually is not sufficient to really justify presence in a given country unless you have strong support. But if you have some support in that country, then I think that there is a strong reason to work with these private or semi-private hospitals.
All right, thank you. The next question from the audience is that have you thought about engaging work institutions such as UNHCR and other NGOs? And if that, what has been your experience with them?
So, you know, we work with WHO and UNHCR and other all the time. What happens is one of two things. Typically, they don't have a lot of funding in general. They have, remember, these are very bureaucratic institutions, and most of the funding is actually in-country funding. So they may have some funding for improving program in country X, so let's say in Mozambique, but then you have to actually talk to both WHO and WHO Mozambique, and they may have other priorities also. So that's one. UNHCR is a little more interesting, but they also have funding sort of challenges. Our experience is that people recognize this as a problem. Our experience is that they feel that this is an issue, but they are really not a major funding body for research. Now, once the product is commercialized, then there is a chance that they may recommend that to take this product. They wouldn't buy it themselves. So the finance model of these of these agencies works that they can make recommendations, but they would not buy medical devices or these kinds of products. But knowing them is important, and certainly partnering with them is important, but they are not a resource for us except for a networking resource.
All right, thank you. So I think that leads to a follow-up question by an audience very nicely. So what are the main challenges in making PharmaChk a viable product? And at the same time, in countries like US, how do you get it approved by the US regulatory bodies as well?
Sure. So let me answer the second one. Because PharmaChk is not a medical instrument, it doesn't require the FDA approval that a medical device would, right? It is an analytical tool. So it is similar to, let's say, getting approval for any other chemical testing facility or chemical testing system, such as liquid chromatography or others. So these can get a PE certification, but not necessarily an FDA requirement. FDA would not regulate these. So that makes our job a lot easier in that regard. That's the answer. Second question is, second part of the thing is, how do you make, what are the challenges? So the challenges are several. In-country partnership is always a challenge because we cannot do a top-down thing. You have to have support of in-country partners. They may be in the public or the private sector, but they have to be there because sitting in Boston or sitting in the US is not going to address that. Second thing is our focus has largely been on life-saving commodities. So antibiotics, TB drugs, antimalarials. Most recently, we have sort of added oxytocin to it, which is used to control postpartum hemorrhage and postpartum bleeding, the single biggest cause of maternal deaths. And that is a change in our model going from just a disease-centric view, sort of TB or malaria, to a management-centric view, which is about sort of making sure that the time of baby's delivery is of joy and of tremendous hope and aspirations, and not of pain and despair. So that's a new aspect that we are looking in. The challenge often is there are hundreds of thousands, or certainly tens of thousands of different drugs. So how do you prioritize? As an academic institution and an academic lab, we don't have the capacity to have our probes for every single drug. So historically, we have prioritized it for life-saving commodities. Now, those life-saving commodities often are in low-income countries. The quality of antibiotics in the US is not an issue. In Germany, it's not an issue, which means that our business models are focused towards these low-income countries. So the challenge often is, what is it that one can do in the US that may also have a revenue stream and certainly allow us to be sustainable, because our focus has largely been on low-income countries. Let me add one last thing to that part. We have started thinking about using PharmaChk for the great challenge that certainly is in Massachusetts, but also in other states, of opioid crisis. So we are working with law enforcement because they often need to know what's in the drugs that are sold on the street, the amount of fentanyl, and there is no technology out there. It's a long road. We're very far from any signed agreement, but that's something that is an opportunity for us that we are thinking about. We've also started working with pharmaceutical companies because they are concerned about their drugs. But all of these things take time, and at the end of the day, we are a largely an academic institution with interest in impact. So oftentimes balancing those two things can be a challenge. But we are always interested in new models and new partners.
All right, thank you. So here's an interesting question, and I know the person who asked, who is also a PhD student in Texas A&M. He has a multi-level question. The first one is around, are you, based on your experience, are you more focused on partnership with governments or at micro-level health-related NGOs, or do you think that the long-term vision is more productizing at a much larger scale without going through these organizations?
Mm-hmm. So let me answer that. Typically, what happens is, the challenge is, it's a great question, and the challenge is each country is different. So in Pakistan, majority of the public, and same thing in India, actually goes and consumes and buys pharmaceutical products in the private sector. So if, God forbid, you get sick, you are going to go to a pharmacy, not get free drugs from the hospital, which means that that's a different system than, for example, in Ghana or in Indonesia, where public sector hospitals would provide a large number of your pharmaceuticals. So that means in two different things, I have to think about partners differently. In Indonesia and Ghana, I have to have partners in the government sector. In Pakistan, not necessarily partners in the government sector, but certainly their approval. So government's approval is absolutely necessary, because even if I am providing testing, the goal is not to test. The goal is to improve the quality of medicines. And that cannot happen in any society without the government's help. So we have to work with government, whether we like it or not, whether we find the government to be not agreeing with the policy that we want. If you want to make an impact on that society, you have to have government partners. I think in addition to that, you can work with sort of micro level partners and commercialize and commoditize these things. But without government support, you are not going to fix the problem that we are trying to fix. Because at the end of the day, the goal is not to sell the product alone, but use the product to solve a much bigger problem that is really making an impact on the lives of people who are most vulnerable.
Interesting. The follow-up question to the same question was that it is completely understandable that it is this particular product could be expensive and the cost of burden could not be put on the individuals. Is there any hope that this could be commercialized at a much lower price point for lower level consumers or smaller organizations and societies?
So that's a great question again. The issue is that we don't want, in some ways, to give it to the people, because there is also a risk of, we're already dealing with massive prescription-free environment where people in Pakistan basically consume any drug they feel like because they feel sick, right? So the antibiotic issue is obvious to everyone. who studies the problem, that you basically consume drugs. So we don't want people to buy something and then test it at home, because then what are you going to do? Let's say you tested it at home and you found that the drug wasn't all that good. So you take it back to the pharmacy. Somebody has to pay for that, and it shouldn't be the consumer. It should be those who are involved in the procurement and custodians of that. And we have tested this multiple times with our, I didn't have the time to go through our sort of market analysis, and there was almost no appetite for having consumers be involved in this, because they're very worried that if they have to test, then are they going to get their money back? I mean, put yourself in the situation in Pakistan or elsewhere where you say that this drug isn't very good, and you go back to the pharmacist and he or she won't return any money. Or if he does, that pharmacist then has to work upstream and get his or her money back. So it becomes a cycle that we want to avoid. The idea is to control it before it enters the market or really gets to the consumer. So one can argue back and forth what is the right point, and I think we are still debating that. But giving it to consumer is, of course, ethically problematic, but also from a business perspective, there was no appetite for that.
All right. So Dr. Zaman, let me share with you the results of our second poll, where was that the question was, where is the best place to deploy this technology? 10% think that urban area hospitals, like in major cities. 10% think port of entry for like Chinese port of entry. 20% at pharmacies, and 60%, which is an interesting number, in rural clinics and rural hospitals.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I don't know what your thoughts on those results are.
You know, it's. I think they mirror a certain level of understanding of the Pakistani system, and also a recognition of how acute the problem is. And I think an agreement that in Pakistan and in many other places, the rural consumer, the rural patient is often the one who is most vulnerable, and we ought to do more for him and her. So particularly if it comes to maternal health, I think your colleagues and the audience are saying things that I find very consistent. The business models of that are certainly much harder, because you need a very distributed system. And again, in that case, in the rural areas, on the other hand, in Pakistan and elsewhere, there is a greater dependence on public systems. So there would, again, the role of government would be critical. In Pakistan, they use something called lady health workers. It's a similar system in other countries of the world, which is called community health workers. So engagement with them certainly would be very helpful, and they are all public employees.
All right, thank you. All right, next question is, and I was expecting this question, that how do you face the challenge of deploying such a product in countries where corruption is widespread and the local mafia will interfere, since this product would impact their counterfeit drug business?
So that's a hard question. In some ways we have to live with that. We are not the policing agency. We don't have any control over law enforcement, and we know whether it is in Pakistan, not so much, but certainly in many other places, this is a huge issue. So what you have to do is try to work with the system and try to find the right people in the government or elsewhere who are really concerned about the problem. I refuse to believe that every single person in the government or in the ministries of health, himself or herself, is corrupt. So you have to develop those relationships over time, which is both cost and time intensive. But just because the government is corrupt or there's widespread corruption doesn't mean that those people in those societies are any less important than our society. So I think if one is interested in addressing the issue for the people, you have to be in some ways ready to say, okay, their government is bad, but I want to protect these people. I want to protect the vulnerable in this community. And then you have to work on that. So I don't think I have ever worked in a country where they were not serious concerns. But at the same time, you have to hopefully create demand from within the system. So Ghana is an interesting example where there is now, and I don't take any credit for this, this was happening before we entered the market, there is an increased demand from the public, and the government is putting more money now, even though the government itself might have had other priorities. But a public level demand, if you sort of work with people and the right group of people, I think that can push government to do the right things, even though the government itself may not be all that good. And I think that can happen in any country. But the question is very good, because it is an ethical conundrum, and I think it's not easy, and it's oftentimes very hard.
Excellent. So the next 2 or 3 questions are more around your journey, and I think audience wants to learn from from your journey and the hard work and the accomplishments that you have received. So the first question is around time management. How do you manage your time with so many different activities, both in academia as well as outside, and then product development and travel and everything else?
I don't know if I manage my time very well. I think whoever is asking that is very generous. I think I don't do a good job. But I think, it's about having a passion for something. If at some point you really are passionate about something that you care deeply, I think you'll always find yourself being more efficient. You may not sort of be wasting that much time, and I think that makes a big difference. You're able to take more time out for these things. I also have a remarkably understanding family, and I think a lot of credit to them as well. The other thing I think is having mentors and people. So I would go to my mentors and ask these kinds of questions. So, Jim, how do you measure? I mean, how do you do this? How do you sort of have these companies and create classroom teaching and all these papers and all? And I would talk to him, and I would tell him how I'm doing this and how I can do it better. And he would tell me, no, don't do this and don't spend time on this and do that. So I think the need for mentors is a lifelong thing. And as I said, some of those mentors may be around. Some of those mentors you find in books. I find Richard Feynman as a great physicist to be a remarkable person. I read about him. I find many German philosophers. I find within the Pakistani tradition, Iqbal to be a person whose thought I find fascinated by at times, not always agreeing. But so you have to really seek the people who can help you, and some of those may not be around, and that's okay. But so those are the 2 things I would say: is having a deep passion, and 2, trying to do the things that you absolutely love, and then trying to get guidance from people, and be as frank, if you can, be with your mentors and be direct in asking those questions.
So that's an excellent segue into the next question, which is that how do you find and choose mentors in your career?
That's a great question. I think some mentors are temporary. You need somebody to look at your CV and tell if it is going to cut it or not. And some are lifelong. And it's just like a group of friends. Some people you meet, you respect, you have a good conversation with them over a cup of coffee or over dinner, and some become lifelong friends. And I think you have to trust your own judgment. I only have a couple of rules. I only work with people whose character and integrity I respect. So somebody might be an outstanding scientist, but if I don't find his or her values to be the same as mine, I find that I don't want to be in that company. And 2, I want people who, and mentors doesn't mean that they have to be super successful. They might just have a nugget of information that you find very valuable. They don't have to be the most famous people, but they have to be people who you get inspired by. So I try to avoid conversations and meetings and sort of events where I'm not inspired. So I think you have to be honest with yourself and don't choose a mentor just because he or she is successful. Instead, choose a mentor who you find inspiring, who helps you think and helps you intellectually develop. And that's my only criteria. And this is actually not very different from scholars around the world who would find some companies to be remarkably stimulating and others to be just painful and suffering. So be a little careful, but and seek it from your heart. And I think you'll find the right people.
All right. Any recommendations on your favorite books?
Oh, a lot. Depends on what people want to read. So I read across the board. So I don't know if I have any recommendations. I can tell you what I'm reading right now. So there are 3 or 4 things that I'm reading right now. So one of them is A History of Science in Soviet Union. It's called Stalin and the Scientists. It's by Simon Inks. I'm also reading a fiction book about the Second World War and the rebuilding from the eyes of a detective. So that's a crime fiction book. It's called Ashes of Berlin. I'm also reading a book on Afghanistan called and Pakistan called Ghost Wars. And on my bedside table is a book by a Latin American Nobel laureate. His name is Mario Vargas Llosa, and his book is called The Neighborhood. That's about sort of citizens sort of rising up against a tyrannical ruler or tyrannical sort of dictator. So I read across the board, and I don't have a favorite genre. I look at the book, and if it seems interesting, I pick up. Sometimes it's about fiction, sometimes about history, sometimes about politics, but I have a fairly high stack of books by my bedside, and I try to read every night if I can.
All right, that's a very wide spectrum of books. All right, our last two questions, Dr. Zaman, is there a dedicated nonprofit U.S. organization which is supporting life sciences initiatives in Pakistan from USA?
The answer is no to the second part of in Pakistan, but there are others which have very sort of, I would say, large footprint. So from the government side, it would be U.S. Agency for International Development. On the private side, certainly Gates Foundation has a huge portfolio in Pakistan. I think the answer, and I would encourage this individual to contact me directly, because it depends on what you want to do. If you're talking about education, that's one thing. If you're talking about sort of science literacy, that's another thing. If you're talking about sort of, I would say, clinical work, that's another thing. So I'm happy to sort of connect this individual to whatever he or she wants, because the answer is no dedicated one in Pakistan alone, but plenty that are working in Pakistan.
All right, thank you. And our last question came from a researcher in the United States, and he is actually interested in seeing any overdose-related issues with the recreational marijuana, where they are legal, and where the THC levels in different edible marijuana products are tested. Do you think that this product can actually be catered to that?
So that's a great question, actually. So in the US, the problem, and I'm glad this individual asked that, in the US, the problem is often not with prescription drugs, but often, well, there is with opioids, but in general, the poor quality issue comes with recreational drugs, with herbal supplements and other things, or things you might just end up buying over Amazon, sort of internet commerce. And we're certainly looking at exploring that opportunity, but again, it would depend specifically on what you're asking. So if you are asking whether it has the right amount or not, yeah, then we can potentially look at that. If you're asking whether it has an impurity that may be sort of problematic for health, that's another question. We can also look at that. So it depends on the nature of the question. Sometimes the product doesn't have what it says, high or low dose, and sometimes it has other things which can be injurious as well. That depends greatly on the nature of question. But the researcher who asked this question certainly is asking the right question, because herbal supplements and recreational drugs, sort of fitness drugs, these kinds of things are not regulated the same way prescription drugs are.
All right, that ends our formal Q&A session, Dr. Zaman. From the audience, if you have any additional questions, feel free to send us an email. We'll be happy to pose that to Dr. Zaman and get his response to that. With that, what I would like to do is basically share with you our future lineup for the PK Inspires webinar. Our next presenter is Ali Ayub, who is actually a global head of information technology at the IB organization. Our topic with him would be the role of IT leadership and case studies that he has gone through for IT contribution in company success, mergers and acquisitions, and how they've gone public in stock market. With that, Taha, I would like you to close.